So moving on then, without too much more onto the topic of today and the ESG. I mean, I must say it's particularly apt that we're actually holding this event now, because it's also the Global Alliance's World PR and Communications Month, which is certainly a good occasion. And then when we come even more closely to the topic of ESG, we have the COP26 coming up in Scotland very soon. The UN remains very focused on its sustainability goals. And so now, if we come to our topic, where should the responsibility for ESG sit? Should it sit with a PR director? Should it sit with other parts of the business? And I'm pleased to say we have a fantastic panel with us today who are going to take care of these very tricky topics. So it's a pleasure to introduce them. First of all, we have Johan Floren, who is the Head of Communications and Corporate Governance at the Stockholm-based Yonder AP Fonden. Apologies if I've mispronounced it, which is the state's alternative to private investment funds. We're also delighted to have Gregory Ross, who is the Head of Sustainability at Petrofac, which is a British provider of energy services to the international oil, gas and renewable energy industries. Then our third speaker will be Charlotte West. Charlotte is the Executive Director of Global Corporate Communications at Lenovo, the $60 billion global technology company. Charlotte is also a board director of the Lenovo Foundation, and she's also a member of its ESG Oversight Committee. And so last but not least, we have Frank Thomas, who is going to be our moderator. So Frank is the director at the 193 Group in New York. 193 is an independent corporate and financial communications advisory firm. So thank you all for being here with us this evening. We're really looking forward to the discussion. And now I would like to hand over to Frank to lead the discussion.
Great, thanks. I assume everyone can hear me.
Yes, we can. Thank you, Frank. Yes.
Thanks for having us. I'm just merely moderating a very interesting group of people, so I won't bore you with any of my sort of opining on the topic. The only thing I would say is that I think we have the luxury of having this kind of conversation because of the outsized role that media and communications has taken in just corporate affairs generally. 15 years ago. It was a much simpler communications landscape, and sort of talking about your results was probably good enough to communicate as a public company or a private company. And now the landscape of communications just has become so much more complex and so much more difficult to navigate that I think, and so much more outsized in the role that it takes within the reputation of a company, that it, now people consider the ethos of the company really to sit often within the communications function. And so I just think that's a really interesting landscape change that allows us to even have a discussion about where does this really important function sit. What I thought might be helpful just at the beginning is to ask sort of each of our panelists to just talk briefly about sort of how they think about ESG within their organization, because I think it's an informative discussion about how do people think about ESG in what's a global manufacturing business, a major global investment platform, and then, frankly, in Greg's business, a business where ESG probably has taken on a new role as sort of the global energy landscape has changed. So, maybe saying that, Greg, maybe we start with you and just maybe you just give us a quick overview sort of how you guys think about ESG, and then maybe Johan and Charlotte can chime in as well, and then have a couple of questions for each of you guys.
Right, sure. Afternoon or good day to all. I guess our ESG strategy has been very much a journey, and it's sort of evolved from something that's been very much CSR focused and very much around our social license to operate to excuse me, to more really focused on really how are we managing our business risks and really messaging that and disclosing that to our stakeholders and who have been very much part of sort of shaping that strategy in the program, and I can touch on that a little bit later, but certainly the strategy that we have is focused on these three ESG pillars, and it's around our environmental stewardship. And for us, that the sort of key bits there are really our net zero program, how we're decarbonising the business, and then it picks up other things with respect to some of our projects, how we manage and work closely to protect biodiversity and reduce environmental incidents, spills and so on, because we do a lot of work offshore. We have producing assets, and then the social part, which I have to say has loomed very large with the pandemic we've had over the last couple of years, which has brought that into really sharp focus. And so the social pieces around how we attract, retain and really engage diverse talent. How do we build a really inclusive work environment? And you know, we have something like I think is it maybe 50 different nationalities, and we operate across 30 countries, and so, you know, really getting the best out of our staff. And you know, the oil and gas industry historically was a very male dominated industry, so you know, we've had a big push to really address issues of diversity and inclusion right the way up our leadership, and then there's another piece which has been typical for our industry about really engendering personal responsibility for safety. We work in a major hazard industry, so it's part of the S, and respecting human rights. We work and we have large engineering construction sites in some geographies where there are 10,000 workers plus on site. They're literally small villages. A lot of those workers are migrant workers, so we recognise their vulnerability around labour rights issues, particularly in some of our geographies. So that's been a big focus. And then finally, I guess the governance piece is around embedding a culture of integrity. So we have transparency of our disclosure. There's access to remedy. We've got speak up programs, and we really engender a culture of trust within the organisation, but also to our stakeholders.
And maybe Johan, maybe you could talk a little bit, just, you know, from the, you know, sort of almost bridging the gap between a global industrial producer and sort of a manufacturer like Lenovo. How do you guys think about sort of ESG within your corporate structure?
Yes, thank you for having me here. Very nice. We're a government pension fund, so we have very clear directives what to do and not to do, and ESG is part of what we have to do. And it has been since the start 20 years ago, so we've been doing it all the time, even though it has evolved. So it's much more complex and well, today you would say much more ambitious and complicated too. And we have something like 70-80 billion pounds asset under management. So it's a lot of money, but very, very small organization, 40 people. And so, and that means that we have a general outsourcing principle, meaning that we employ as few as possible. Everything that you can buy somewhere else, we don't employ anyone. And this is, from my perspective, it's a great advantage when you come to ESG, since this is evolving so fast. The rate of development is just breathtaking. And this means that you can very quickly ramp up what you try to do. We're a typical universal owner, which means that we're invested in all markets, in all industries, and our portfolio looks like reality, like the global equity market. And we think our prime contribution to sustainable development is as active owners. So we use our voting rights, we engage with companies, we file shareholder resolutions. We also blacklist individual companies that are acting in conflict with international norms and conventions regarding human rights, environment, corruption, labor rights, etc. And we do use securities litigation and that type of action whenever it's relevant. And I mean, this is not very common. I think we have about 16 trials going on right now, and most of them in US, because you have this class action approach that you can use in your legal system. And it's more complicated in other countries. We have one with Volkswagen too, but that's less common. So we try to be a force for, when it comes to climate, of course, it's on top of the agenda, and transition is what everybody is working with. And we try to speed these things up. And the goal, of course, is net zero emissions in 2050, but you have to have a lot of intermediate targets and milestones on the way there. Otherwise, it's not worth much as a commitment. So we're working on that too, and to get our investor climate action plan detailed and published, and for all kind of stakeholders to engage with. Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
No, really, really helpful. And maybe Charlotte, having against the backdrop of those two sort of ways that the practice works, how do you guys, as a, obviously quite sprawling global organization that touches a bunch of different geographies and a bunch of different, cultures and business mindsets, how do you guys think about it, in both from a communication standpoint, but also just from a practitioner standpoint?
Yeah, it was fascinating listening to Greg and Johan in terms of, I don't think I've really appreciated, probably until listening to the two of them, because the three of us are in such fundamentally different industries, totally different structures of organizations, totally different end goals as an organization. And actually, I think it's made me, just in the few minutes that we've spoken already, appreciate much more the breadth of how we need to think about this in the respective roles that we've got. And I imagine the people, on the call listening come from equally vast organisations or represent equally vast clients. So, the more I think about this, the more fascinating it is. But anyway, from a Lenovo point of view, so big global technology company operating in 180 markets around the world, about 75,000 employees, a lot of, high percentage of factory workers within that employee number. But certainly not the majority. And you may know us as a company that came out of China. You may be using one of our products right now, a ThinkPad, if you are, or a Motorola phone. You're definitely using one of our products. And I think that comes with some baggage and some viewpoints that people might have about us and who we are as a company. But just thinking about our ESG journey, I've been at Lenovo 10 years, not always in this particular role, but in various roles. And I feel like most big companies have probably been on a similar journey, particularly companies like us that make things, like we make things in factories that have to be shipped and moved around the world using airplanes, boats, trains, trucks, etc. So it's a very sort of tangible thing that we do, which is obviously a bit different to Greg and Johan in that sense. But when I first joined, and I joined in the UK, there was probably, indifference might be too strong a word, but just a kind of acceptance of, ESG is this thing over here, it's owned by legal, we need to tick some boxes to make sure we're all doing the things that we're meant to be doing, and we're not getting sued because we've done something wrong in a factory, or we're employing 12-year-olds or whatever, or mining cobalt in Democratic Republic of Congo or whatever it is. So I think there was very much like it was just part of the sort of like BAU drumbeat, like business stuff that the legal team did. And given we're an company with a really strong engineering heritage, I think it was probably approached with that mindset as well. But I think now we're at a point, again, like many companies on this call, where in a way, I feel like we've almost created a bit of an ESG monster internally, but in a good way. We've just got to be able to get our hands around it and control it. Because ESG is being talked about in every department, in every bit of the business, in almost every call that I sit on, in every earnings call, in every executive presentation. And that is incredible that they're all realizing now that there's not only it's a requirement of businesses from a legal point of view, it's a requirement of businesses from a moral point of view in terms of the role that we play in the world. And actually, we will only do better if every person in the business does something to help us get there across any one of the three pillars. I read a really interesting article in the FT a couple of weeks ago from the environmental correspondent talking about COP26 and greenwashing and everything. And she used a really interesting phrase. She said, you know, and it was really specifically about path to net zero for companies. And she said, you know, net zero, it's thousands of tiny, boring steps to get there. And which is true, right? You know, when you think about it, thousands of tiny, boring steps. And I think that's the bit in comms that's interesting for me, is helping the business navigate how we talk about ESG, make it meaningful and not greenwashing, being the kind of prodder and poker and outside voice that is saying, no, 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 that's not what the world's talking about. You might want to talk about that, but that's not what the world's talking about. We need to talk about this. Or being provocative and like pushing the business on goals, but also you know, making sure that it's controlled in the business as well, and we haven't got some wild west of people going off talking about, particularly about net zero goals, that they don't understand and don't realize there's thousands of boring tiny steps to get there. So that's probably thinking about the journey that we've come on from an ESG point of view. So it's incredibly exciting, but also a little bit like it's like a rushing river, I would say, internally, and sometimes we feel like we're in one of those rubber rings out of control flowing down it. But I'm sure that's similar to lots of people on this call.
Yeah, no, I think there's a couple of interesting things. I'd love to come back there. One thing I just note administratively is, like, we will have Q&A at the end. So if people want to just keep their questions and type them into the chat, we'll get through those at the end. But the one thing you raised that I think is important is obviously sort of, you know, there's, to me, is an inherent risk when you embed ESG within a communications function, that it's perceived as a sort of merely a brand, sort of additive to your brand and not necessarily additive to your operations as a business. And so I wanted to ask this question first to Greg, not to put him on the spot, but obviously everyone, you know, feel free to chime in here. Is, you know, Greg, you're in a business that's inherently has a reputation as probably not the most ESG minded. The world is in a transition, you know, a transitory phase around the way it consumes energy. As you noted to me, you know, your job is a black mark sometimes with the younger generation. How do you think about communicating, you know, ESG in an industry and space where it maybe is not a natural, you know, it hasn't always had a natural fit, and where frankly you're faced probably with the challenge of communicating something that, you know, a large portion of your business may not be yet aligned with? You know, how do you think about that in the modern landscape?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, because you know, we are an energy services company which just has a legacy of fossil fuels, and in fact a large proportion of our portfolio is fossil fuels. We're transitioning to renewables, and yes, I do have challenges sometimes when I talk to my I mentioned earlier, I talk to my teenage daughter's friends and they ask me what you do, and as soon as I hear oil and gas, because they're all passionate climate advocates, there's a real antipathy there. But I think so I think when communicating ESG, particularly to our stakeholders, it can at times be challenging. We can at times be seen as being on the wrong side of the climate debate. But look, look, to be seen as being authentic and credible, and that's really what we strive for. I found that we have to be absolutely transparent about what we're doing, warts and all, and obviously there's a risk attached to that, and there's a sensible balance to be struck. But I think when I'm talking about our ESG messaging, you know, I like what Charlotte said about a journey of a sort of 1,000 steps. Some of them aren't exciting, and it is. I mean, it is a journey, and I know that sounds a bit glib and very 80s, but it's you know, we're progressively trying to transition, and there's probably a level of impatience within some of our broader stakeholders that they think it's a binary thing. You just flick a switch and suddenly the world becomes renewable, and you know, it's an energy transition, and the clues in the name, it's a transition. It has to be gradual. You know, we all still are wedded to fossil fuels in some degree or another. And just as we phased out of wood into coal, and we will eventually phase out of coal into gas, to oil, and to nuclear and other renewable new energies, which we're going into, everything has a part to play. And so we, so getting back to your question, we have to be authentic. We talk about what we're doing. We focus on what's material, getting back to Charlotte's point about not just what makes a headline. You know, sometimes we chase headlines, and rather than talking about things which are maybe a bit relatable and maybe not so extraordinary, but people can connect with it. And we also strive to be open, tell our stakeholders what we're doing, some of the challenges we face around delivering net zero. It's not, I mean, often it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Not everyone in my organization is bought into it, and that's the challenge, which I relish. We have to tell those stories, speaking to you all as communicators. We have to humanize it, tell those personal, almost everyday stories of people that can connect with, share our successes and our pain points. And I believe that makes for better, more credible comms, that makes for relatable comms. And then ultimately, I think it gets over that potential cynicism that, oh, this is just an energy company trying to be green. No, we are an integral part of that energy transition, and we will evidence our journey in an authentic way, both in terms of how we are working with our oil and gas clients to lower their emissions and decarbonize, and there's a big chunk of work being done there. As well as how we're transitioning our business to new energies and looking at things like blue and green hydrogen, and looking at circular economy and how we can generate energy from waste, how we can, as you can see from the picture on the backdrop there, how we build, we build big HVDC converter stations that go into the ocean to convert the energy that's coming off these wind turbines and then feed that into the grid as renewable power. So, if we're going to nail net zero, if we're talking specifically about the climate piece of sustainability, we have to use every tool in the box.
Maybe, I mean, to build on that, you talk about sort of you have the luxury of sort of, looking from inside a company. Johan, you probably have, the opposite luxury, which is your platform invests in, fund managers all over the world doing a variety of different things. Those fund managers then invest in untold number of other products who are doing a variety of things. Like, how do you think from a communicator's perspective about sort of showcasing the efforts that the platform is making, and frankly, understanding, like, managing the risks of that scope and sprawl of what is an investment platform that inevitably touches, millions and millions of consumers, but also, hundreds and hundreds of companies through your partners?
Well, let me answer 2 things. The first one is the question that we started with: should this be within communications? Should ES be a part of that? And I guess, I think the short answer would be, why not? And I hear this a lot. Oh, it's under communication, then it's not for real. But I think it might be an indicator, and I'll get back to that looking from the investor perspective. But I think from my own industry, what I've seen, the important thing, if it's not a department of its own, ESG or corporate responsibility or sustainability or whatever you call it, it's not a department on its own. Where should it be? I think it could be anywhere. The critical thing is, do you have the expertise and the competence within this department? So me, for example, I'm head of ESG and communications. So I have more people that are experts in ESG than in communication, but they work together, and it's an excellent combination. It's so much about trust and transparency and relations and things like that. So if you put it somewhere down in the factory in the lower compounds and they have no contact with the external world, it's not going to be very successful. And if you also combine that with having the communications are designed by an agency outside, it could be catastrophic. So one thing is if you have the expertise, and the other thing, of course, is where in the organization are you positioned? If ESG is reporting to corporate communications, that is a part of the marketing department, and the marketing director is reporting to the CEO, then you're going to be very far away from where the decisions are made. That's not a good thing. My boss is the CEO, and he's very engaged in this. So we are on an everyday basis having this discussion about sustainability and things like that. Of course, I realize I'm fortunate. It's very much about the person. It's not about the position. So I think it could be fantastic to have ESG within communications if you have the expertise there. And I've seen the opposite within my industry, that you say that it should not be in communications, it should be in the asset management department. The chief investment officer should be responsible of this. But if the chief investment officer is not really interested in this, he or she is very enthusiastic about numbers and assets and allocation and things like that, he or she is gonna manage this with the left hand and really no chance of doing a great job. So I think where in the organization is one thing, and do you have the competence, the expertise, that's another part. Then if I switch and move over to being an owner of some 3,500 companies or something like that. Of course, you have to go on optics to some extent, meaning that you look on different indicators. Is this organization serious about sustainability and ESG? Well, if you have someone 3-4 levels down in the hierarchy that is the number one ESG expert and nothing above this person, then of course it's a bad signal, sort of. It looks like you don't prioritize this thing. But if this is the only thing that you evaluate, you're going to do a very shallow analysis. You have to look at a lot of other different things before you can actually judge whether the company is serious or not. And in the end, it's about, what are the impact and the actions in the real economy. And even though a lot of this is not very easy to measure and evaluate, there are things that you can evaluate. And from an investor perspective, of course, carbon emissions is merely an indicator, but for a company, it's very real. If you can lower your emissions, there's no doubt that you're working with these things. So I think that it's a way to go into a discussion where is your ESG department in your organization, but then you have to have a lot more information before you actually come to some more definite conclusion about it.
And do you think, and I put this question to Charlotte, and then we can maybe do some audience Q&A, but obviously I'd love to hear everyone chime in here. Is like, you sit in a large corporate infrastructure, right? Do you feel like as a communicator, you have the license to sort of like have an ESG decision-making role, or do you think it's, do you feel like you run the risk sometimes of falling into more of it becoming just an element of your brand versus like an ethos that runs throughout what is a large organization, and obviously, it has, I'm sure, a lot of, sort of varied points of decision making.
Yeah. Do you want to go ahead, Johan? Sorry.
No, sorry.
I was going to say on that a couple of things. So in a large corporate, I think most of the time ESG will sit within legal somewhere somehow, because ESG's grown out of an investment risk foundation, therefore tends to sit within the department that can handle that best. And in the case of a company like Lenovo, that tends to be the legal team. Our chief responsibility officer is a lawyer, but we have other significant stakeholders within the ESG mix. So our chief diversity officer is not a lawyer, has come from an HR background. So there's different voices and different stakeholders within the mix now that I think make it a much broader, much more interesting topic. And I think what's interesting from a comms point of view in terms of what we bring to the table is that if you look at legal is about managing risk, and we're in comms about turning risks into opportunities from a comms point of view. So in that sense, we're kind of a perfect combination to work on ESG together. So I'm not interested in a company like the one I work in of worrying about the emissions of our factory, like the detail, of the emissions of our factories, tracking all the data, all of those like head-hurting things that are done far better by a different department than comms. The role that we play is like the outside-in counsel and as the forcing function for the business to drive change. And I'll mention an example in a minute, and kind of the storytellers to bring it to life, whether that be internally or externally. So an example of the forcing function piece is that we've had a sustainability report in its broadest sense for about 15 years. It was originally called a sustainability report. It was a Hong Kong Stock Exchange requirement, which is where we're listed. But it was quite narrow. Going back to this point about it was a bit of a tick box exercise. It needed to be done. Therefore, it was done path of least resistance. One thing that we've always prided ourselves on as a company is kind of the diversity of our leadership and the breadth of the business, given that we were established in China and founded there. We acquired some US businesses like IBM's PC business, much more global company. But we never talked about diversity in that sustainability report in any way. And nobody had the appetite in the business to go and do that, but we did in comms. So we developed the company's first diversity report, and for 3 years we ran that. And then we were like, actually, it's not really our job. We've created this thing as a forcing function to get the business to be held accountable for certain numbers, because people don't want to go backwards after they've set a target or a goal or showed a strong improvement. And that's now formed part of the wider ESG report, making it a much more holistic report. But it kind of came from comms. So I think that's the opportunity for us is, we're not, and it may be different in Johan's organization, but for us, like the skill set for doing the detailed ESG work is not in my team. But I think what we can do is bring the insight to what matters, what's important, what our stakeholders care about, particularly our employees, which is, increasingly more important, and bringing it to life in something meaningful. And working in partnership with the team that does run it from that perspective. And if you've got a good relationship then with that part of the organization, then I think it's great. So yeah, I just wanted, that was sort of the reaction to your question, Frank, if I've answered it, which I'm not sure that I have. One thing I need to just say as a caveat at the beginning of this meeting, I was at the PR Week Awards last night. I don't really drink, but I didn't have much sleep, and it was like proper out for the first time in the PR industry. It was fantastic for the last 18 months. So limited sleep, but also, Greg, what was quite interesting, there were protesters outside Grosvenor House in London with handing out leaflets, naming and shaming oil and gas companies and the PR agencies that represent them.
Yeah, no, it's an ongoing challenge. Yeah. I think the whole climate debate has become so polarized, yeah, and also very politicized in some of the geographies we operate in, and so it's sometimes a difficult sort of rope to walk. Yeah, and look, picking up your point, I mean, I work in a comms team, a comms and sustainability team. My background is I'm a scientist. I've got an operational background. I've worked on large projects, but I spend a lot of my time interfacing with both the comms and marketing professionals. We need to message what we're doing. We need to communicate it widely to get a sort of broad engagement. But we also need to understand Having worked at site for 3 years, I know how appreciated things that are developed in corporate out of a book without any reference to the operational folk are received when that lands on your desk in Iraq, and you're thinking, who
Who wrote this?
what navel was this pulled out of without any thought or consideration? So look, Johan makes a great point. It's about the skill set wherever it sits, and look, I've got colleagues in some of our peers who sit within an HSE, a health, safety, and environment and sustainability function. I've got some who sit in a broader governance function. I think the key thing is about that sort of communication piece. So I network broadly with our governance. So I oversee a sustainability strategy, but network with our HR folk who lead on the diversity and inclusion and a lot of our social programs. I network with our HSE who deal with a lot of the safety and welfare and well-being programs, and with our legal team who deal with a lot of the ethics and governance and programs, as well as the environment function sits directly under me, and so a lot of my day-to-day is about net zero and delivering that, messaging that. So I think, it's wherever it sits. I think it's the key thing is about engaging broadly, ensuring that when we're trying to deliver these, what are effectively change initiatives, is trying to get that traction and communicate that sufficient sense of urgency that motivates people into action. And I know as communicators, that's what you do well. And so I love working in a comms team because I learn a lot to improve my own communication about how to get those compelling messages across that drive action. What are the strategies that we need to take? And I'll share just one of them with you now, which is we get a lot of interest from our staff. How can I get involved in our plastics reduction strategy? How can I get involved in our decarbonisation strategy? So we're setting up essentially a community of practice. So really to almost democratise sustainability down to our staff. It's an employee-driven an initiative, really to facilitate collaboration, sharing ideas, sort of running monthly webinars just like this, where we will talk about really how we're getting to net zero. People talk about net zero, but a lot of the engagement we do with our investors, they say, look, we love your commitment and that ambition. We've got an ambition of net zero across our scope 1 and 2 emissions, our direct emissions and the energy we purchase by 2030. That's a massive commitment. They love the ambition. They're not yet convinced with how we're going to get there. They want to see the credible steps, and that's a fair call. You've only got to see the press. Everyone is coming out with a net zero. It seems to be the latest badge to wear, and certainly a lot of our stakeholders really want to see the devil in the detail and the proof points that we're actually delivering that. So that's been a lot of my focus, which is really pulling in those stories that just evidence how we're progressing to net zero, how we're addressing and creating a more inclusive and diverse working environment, how we're investing in local communities to build that real in-country value and contributing back to the country rather than this sort of extractive model of going in, doing the project, getting paid and then leaving. So it's an exciting time to be in ESG and sustainability, and I love working in comms and doing events like this.
Yeah. Craig, can I touch on one thing that you talked about? Because you talked about the stakeholders and we've talked about skills and where they are, and it kind of, it doesn't matter. The one thing that I think is really interesting now is that in traditional businesses, to drive something through, it becomes like a top-down approach. It's the CEO might unveil something or talk about something, have expectations of leadership. I think as we drive, ESG through our respective organisations, I'm seeing much more bottom-up, much more like, young people, not necessarily young, but people that are passionate about the world and the role that they can play in making it better, in which whatever form that is. So I think a lot of the innovation and the interest in doing more in our company is coming from that part of the organisation. And it's interesting because Frank, when you do the, or maybe it's Samantha when she did the intro, mentioned that I sit on the company's ESG oversight committee. If I look at that committee, it's all executives. And actually, I want a different committee that is actually a product manager or a logistics guy, or, you know, other people that have come in with totally different perspectives that have actually got the appetite to drive the change, and maybe still the, you know, a passion to do it, and don't necessarily see the problems and worrying about, you know, hitting corporate KPIs, but they can just really, being candid, get some shit done, because that's what needs to happen to drive this change. So I think it is turning it on its head a bit and putting good pressure on the business to say, or, you know, to demonstrate that things can be done from anywhere by anybody. And I think that is something that we're certainly seeing.
No, absolutely.
Sorry, Greg.
We set up local carbon management teams across the business just to pull in these ideas from staff. So really, we have we have staff as idea incubators that feed into these local teams, and we set up an initiative called Future Think Tank, which and the tagline was, you know, this is your opportunity to shape the future direction of the business. And a lot of the ideas that have come out of these initiatives are now being implemented in our eliminating single-use plastics, looking at how we can bring in better plastics or less plastics to our offices, our sites, looking at how we can promote a circular economy. And look, the adage, and it's, you'll be familiar with this, I'm sure, you know, none of us are smarter than all of us. You know, the IDEO, which just resonates with me. You know, the more we democratize this, the more we reach out and really tap into the energy and enthusiasm of our staff, the better outcomes. The better we set ourselves up for more productive outcomes.
Yeah.
So I think we've reached. I'd love to get some audience Q&A. Samantha, I think you teed up some questions in the chat that I know you were going to dive into.
Absolutely. Yes, well, thank you very much, Frank, for moderating the session for us, and thank you to all of our panelists. It's been fascinating so far, and we can see it stimulated a number of very interesting questions from our team and colleagues here. So first of all, we've had Eva McLean, who asks a very provocative question. Maybe we'll ask this to Charlotte. So Eva says, Philip Morris is diversifying into respiratory drug products through its acquisition of Vectura for £1 billion. Do you think this is a cynical move and akin to greenwashing? Charlotte, what would you say to that?
I mean, this is not me wearing my, well, I'm going to wear two hats. My general public, just, you know, 40-something-year-old woman, lives in the UK, ex-smoker. Absolutely, it's greenwashing. Of course it is. Wearing my comms hat, I feel the same. You can't market your way or buy your way out of a problem. And I think it's that, you know, I don't know enough about that deal or what Vectura do to know really what that is. But, you know, the only way for us to stop smoking, you know, cancer being an issue because of smoking hazard, is for there to be no smoking. So good luck, Philip Morris. I don't know if they're a client, Ava, or you've got some connection there. You know, feel free to add any comment or insight based on what you know.
So, well, we'll wait and see in the chat, Eva, if any comment on that. So moving on then, I think we'll move to Johan for our next question, which comes from Andras. So the question is, do you think that the ESG comms has become more like a conversation with multiple stakeholders, or more like a sort of more than traditional broadcasting in a one-way street? What would you say, Johan, to that question?
I would say it's definitely dialogue. And I mean, the more you become a sender without listening, the worse you're going to do. And I also think that you should watch this not from a company-centric perspective. You should see this as a process with a lot of different actors that are involved. Some of them are companies, some of them are investors, there are NGOs, there are legislators, etc. And it's actually everybody are affecting everybody. So, and if you're looking at it from that perspective, it's more like you're part of a conversation, and you get someone to have expectations on you, and either you try to fulfill them, or you have to start defending why you're not doing it, or present an alternative, and then the discussion is going in another direction, sort of.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Well, now we
I would
want
just
sorry,
add to that, Samantha.
Yes,
sorry, because I think that's a really good point, and it's because we've seen this real change, we're shifting in comms, and look, technologies aside and the number of comms platforms, certainly it is much more about engagement. It's much more about two-way comms rather than the sort of traditional broadcasting, getting your message out there. You really need now, and what we're seeing is to engage in dialogue, and certainly a lot of our stakeholder interactions are very much around that, and obviously the challenges for that is that it inherently means that that times is good and bad, and because you are at times going to get criticism or protesters, and so I think probably with some companies that drives a level of reticence, or at least a risk aversion as to managing those communications. But I think that's certainly the direction of travel, and really the demands that we're seeing more around corporate communications, and really what are we doing in sustainability, why are we doing it, and how we're doing it.
Great, thank you very much. Well, I think we'll stick with the topic of engagement, Gregory, which you were just mentioning here. So our next question comes from Maggie. So she says, there are a lot of companies trying to engage with ESG. Are there any particular initiatives in PR that have stood out for you recently? So Gregory, in your domain, anything that has particularly stood out in recent times?
Gosh.
I've got a viewpoint on that, Greg, if you want to be thinking.
Well, go on, Charlotte.
Yeah, jump in.
I don't think there should be ESG PR campaigns. I really don't. I think ESG has to be embedded in every single thing that you do, every moment, every event, every speaking opportunity, every time your executive speaks, all of those things. It's not, if we make it about campaigns, then the line that we cross into greenwashing is very easily, we very easily fall the wrong way. So, we look at a lot of things like, so when we're launching new products, so a new laptop, for example, then there's a mandate to the team that says you have to somehow, somewhere, at some point include some message that talks to the green credentials of the product. That could be the packaging, for example, or it could be the energy consumption. It could be something. So it has to be something that you've got to point to. You've got to find something. And if you don't find something, then we're not really probably going to prioritize that from a product launch perspective and focus on it. Likewise, if we think about the S, then it's showing often, not telling, right? So if we're going to have a panel of speakers at an event in front of our customers, don't have 5 white men of 40 to 50 years old, mix it up a bit. So show not tell. And it's the same with governance, which is the hardest one, I think, always. Nobody goes out and says, we've got really strong governance as a company, we're great. Again, you have to do it by showing the diversity of your board, or the checks and balances that you have in place through, other structures that you have in the business. So for me, I couldn't point, there's probably is some great campaigns out there, so maybe being a bit harsh, but you have to build it into every single thing that you do. Otherwise, it's marketing.
Yeah, look, thanks for coming to my rescue, Charlotte. with these panels, you almost have to have it, and doesn't give a great deal of time for thought. Look, one of the things my wife speaks really passionately about, and I'm sure a number of you will have seen it, is the Patagonia campaigns, and she really enjoys the storytelling, and it gets to that point I was making earlier about authenticity and really getting your message across, but telling those really sort of relatable human stories, and So people, and so I think our stakeholders are increasingly astute. They have access to so much data and information, and they are very opinionated, and so I think when you can tell those stories in a very authentic way and show how, you know, sustainability isn't just whatever it isn't just a topical campaign, but it's something that is inextricably linked to your business strategy, that it's how you future-proof your organization. And for us, that's been very much, you know, we engage broadly with all our stakeholders, well, as many of our stakeholders as we could, to ask them, you know, what are the issues about ESG that you really guide your decisions around Petrofac, and then reached out to our staff, and then identified the ones that really we feel are important, that we need to progress, and look, and you know, the more voices inputting, I believe, leads to better outcomes, and that's really shaped our program, and so I think yeah, that authenticity piece, and getting back to your question, I think it's the Patagonia is one example which I found really quite inspiring and really interesting to look at those stories and see, you know, this is really sustainability in action.
The difference with Patagonia, I mean, I agree with Patagonia. Your wife's quite right. It's amazing, but
you can't afford that because she'll take it.
No, I didn't mean. but that's where the business started. We're all trying to retrofit. That's the difference, right? So, you know, I think that's the challenge for lots of us in this space, is that we're trying to stick plasters over some stuff that is perhaps not, you know, seen as very good, or, you know, particularly for you, Greg, in the industry that you're in, it's, you know, it's incredibly hard and challenging and rewarding, I'm sure, all at the same time. But, you know, you're starting from a point of negativity before you've even begun to turn the opinion. So, you know, your example of your daughter's friends that, you know, essentially think you're, you know, some kind of pariah because of the industry that you work in actual fact, being on the inside in a company like Petrofac and having the ability to, you know, kind of shape it from within, is maybe that's why if I worked in a cigarette company, I'd feel different to how I just answered Ava's question. But anyway, but you can drive change, and you can force things to happen and force things through that you couldn't from the outside. But I think that's the problem. We're all retrofitting and trying to kind of catch up, whereas Patagonia did it from the start.
But you will get that sort of that development curve of those who are the sort of innovators and are driving that change, and, you know, the early adopters who are coming and taking those ideas. But look, I think if the general direction is positive, then I think the key, and one of the things we focus on, is really collaborating and making this something that you don't really have to compete with. I collaborate broadly with my industry peers. I also look outside of our industry and collaborate on things like how can we get together and collectively look at addressing things like embodied carbon in our supply chain. You know, the steel we purchase vast amounts of to build our structures. Can we engage the steel industry around lower carbon steel? Can we engage the cement industry around lower carbon cement? And I think the only way we're going to really to nail this is by working together. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we've only got 3 minutes left of our original schedule, so I think I will take the chair's ability to hang on for a further 5 after that, just so we can get a few more questions in. So we've got a comment from Clow in Jamaica that agrees with you about ESG belongs where it best fits, and also to take into account the size of the organisation. We have a question from Sudha, who says, I think this one will be for Johan. So how important is it to keep ESG rooted in your company's purpose while responding to issues impacting broader society or the world? And is this where the comms part has a big role to play? Johan, what would you say to that?
Yes. I'm just kidding. No.
Well, I want this to be short, so we're running out of time. But we can permit you another couple of words if you wish.
Yeah, a couple of words. I mean, in our case, if I just speak for us, it is a part of our purpose. We're actually governed by a law where it says that we have to take these things into consideration. This affects our organization in the long run, of course, since it's such a high priority. But when you do this, it's still something you do in a constant collaboration with both your peers and your counterparts and the rest of the global society. So thinking about it as something that starts from within and then you just announce it to the world, I think that's completely wrong. It starts, your purpose is part of it, but you have to be in constant engagement and interaction because you do it, it's a collaborative effort. So.
Okay, thank you. So we've got a few comments. We've got from Amanda. She says, I've worked with PMI. The main focus is on removing coal from the supply chain and maintaining natural woodlots. And also incremental change is something even for the traditionally dirty industry. We've got another comment also from Anne Gregory, who says it used to be that fund folders did not invest in dirty companies. Now they do. Can you please explain the thinking process, Johan? So Johan, I'm afraid you're on the spot again from Anna
Very
Gregory.
briefly, I said that this is a complete change in perspective. One perspective is that as long as my money doesn't touch anything bad, I will be happy. I mean, the consequence, if you look at listed equity, the consequence of this is nothing. If we sell our stocks to someone else, nothing has happened in the world. No company has changed. So we are actually looking at the complete opposite way. If we are owners, we can have an effect, we can have impact, and we can do something. Of course, it's part of this that we have to be convincing or prove it that we're actually doing something, that there are results. But as soon as we sell, there's just nothing we can do anymore. And if there's a problem, someone else has to solve it. So I would say that when you sell something dirty, it's actually running away and leaving a problem for someone else to solve.
Yeah. Thank you, Johan. Well, I think I'll just ask one last question just to wind up the session, which has been absolutely fascinating. So it's a question that I've come up with myself, which is to say, based on the discussion, I mean, if we think a bit more about, about ESG, which is in a way a combined agenda, because many companies don't have an equal emphasis on environment and the social and the governance part. My question would be, what is the single most important thing that the PR director can do for you? Because it's like, I mean, as I think that Charlotte puts it incredibly well to say, ESG is a bit like a monster. It's there everywhere, no matter what you're doing, it's always there somewhere. So, I mean, how do you organize all of this? I mean, Charlotte, maybe I'll come to you first to say, I mean, you're someone who's obviously in the sort of from the PR perspective. I mean, what is the single most important thing that the PR director can do to help put all of this in perspective and to organize it in a way that really tells a story?
Can I have two things? Is that all right?
Yeah,
So first of all, I would say it's control. That may not be quite the right word, but so much of our job is our job is split into two halves, really, aren't they? Of managing stupid stuff and looking at the good stuff. So I think when it comes to ESG, it's that control of making sure that the business doesn't go and say something stupid, some random sales guy over here doesn't go and overcommit on something. So doing the boring but important thing of having strong messaging in place, keeping it updated, making sure everybody is aligned around that so that nobody's kind of going off script. So I think it's that control piece. And then the second bit is the forcing functions, that are constantly holding the business accountable, looking outside in to make sure that we're looking, I think we're very good in comms at looking to the future, seeing trends, seeing what might be happening politically, see what might be happening socially from an activism point of view, and reflecting that back in our work. So I think it's like boring control and then future looking stuff.
Excellent. Thank you, Charlotte. Well, I think I'll now come on to Johan to say, sort of from the active owner's perspective that you started out with at the beginning of the discussion. I mean, tell us a bit for you. What is the most important thing that for you a PR director can do?
Well, if you're a pure PR director, so you have this very clearly defined role, then of course it's about sweeping the surroundings and keeping control of relations and being the dialogue expert within your organization. And I think this is a very important role. So I think that you clearly have an important job to do, but I think you will do it poorly if you have no ESG competence of your own. If you're pure PR and you have no idea about this new thing, sustainability, but sure, I can talk about anything, then it will be a great handicap. So it's better if you have a bit of both.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. So lastly, Gregory, so please do tell us your perspective. What would you say is the most important thing that the PR director can be doing from your perspective?
I'm gonna default to 3, and I'll tell you why. And it does relate to the sort of the challenges we've had to get this strategy off the ground. And I pull it from a book I read way back when by a couple of authors, Chip and Dan Heath, called Switch: How to Change Things When Change is Hard. Because really, this ESG strategy we've been unfolding is really a change. It's a transformation initiative to how do we get that off the ground. And the book refers to a rider, an elephant, and a path. Directing the rider, the sort of head, and it picks up Charlotte's points about people need to understand how we're going to deliver this change, and all these things are predicated with comms, and the rider, motivating the rider, is about the heart, connecting with people. It's fine to understand why we're doing it, but if people don't have this visceral, I believe passionately about this, then it's not going to get off the ground. And the final thing is about shaping the path. It's fine to have all this passion and all this energy, but if they don't have any clear direction, you're going to go nowhere fast. And I am going to show my age here, but I don't know whether you guys remember there was an image of Carl Lewis in heels, if you look it up if you don't remember it. It's about 20 years ago. It was for a Pirelli or one of these tires, and the tagline was something like power is nothing without control, and it really sort of captured it for me. In that we can, if we don't, we have to connect with people's heads, with hearts, but we also have to show them that direction of travel and direct that energy. And to me, that's the role of and what I get from our communications team is that it's all of this is predicated on good comms, broad engagement, and really connecting with people to ensure that we deliver this message and drive the program forward.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Gregory, for the last words. Well, I think it's been an absolutely wonderful discussion. Fascinating to hear all of the different perspectives. So thank you to all of you for joining us. I mean, I think that the ESG story will run and run. So perhaps in another 10 years, we'll have you all back again to see what happens. But thank you, all of you, for your time for joining us today. Thank you also for everyone from our committee, our new members, will welcome, and to all of those that have joined from different parts of the world. It's been wonderful to have you with us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon on our next webinar. So thank you, everyone. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.